Sometimes, if you want to shed a little light on things, you have to go groping around in the dark. And let's face it, when it comes to our prehistoric sites, the truth is, we're in the dark about most of them. A little light can reveal some remarkable clues, but what it can never do, on the other hand, is show us the bigger picture. Imagine that our modern architecture could stand the test of time, and that in 5,000 years, all that was left were the shells of our buildings. There'd be nothing to tell the difference between an office block and a hospital, or a church hall and a jazz club, or even a warehouse and an aircraft hangar. And that's the problem with so many of our ancient sites. They look similar in appearance, but were they similar in function? Across the length and breadth of the British Isles, we have a breathtaking richness of archaeological heritage. Some mysterious and alien, some less so. This film is about that heritage. And it's only by being here, standing with these ancient stones, that we can begin to get a sense of that bigger picture, begin to understand what these extraordinary places were all about. I'm not an academic, and I don't claim to be an expert, but I have been exploring primitive cultures and prehistoric sites for many years. Now, the plus side of that is that whilst embracing current archaeological knowledge and theories, it does also give me the freedom to offer some contentious ideas from time to time without getting the sack. The downside of that, of course, is that sometimes I might be talking rubbish. Who knows? The purpose of this film is not to give a history lesson about our Neolithic and Bronze Age ancestors, but to explore and experience what they left behind. And as we travel across the British Isles, maybe we can shed some light on these mysterious places and the people who built them. So follow me. Believe it or not, this wall is about 5,000 years old, but look what it's a part of.
This is the Ballawall Barrow at Land's End, right down at the southwestern tip of mainland Britain, and its structure is unique in the whole of the British Isles, but its purpose, well, that's something else. There are burials here. And a burial site is very rarely just a burial site. And what's more, excavations have uncovered Bronze Age artefacts here as well, which means that this site could have been in continuous use for 2,000 years. And I wish I could tell you what it had been used for over all that time. The complexity of this site is fascinating. Some burials face outwards to the sea or the rising and setting sun. Others are internal in what would originally have been a dark and enclosed space. The inner section was probably built a long time before the outer ring, and like so many ancient sites, it's not unusual to have differences of opinion about when they were built and what they were actually used for. Archaeologists have a difficult task teasing the information from the earth, and without thorough excavations over a wider area, sometimes the conclusions have to be based on very small strands of evidence. We know there are Bronze Age burials here, but does that necessarily mean it's a Bronze Age building? We'll come back to the subject of dating later. To begin with, it's clear to see that contrary to the way our ancestors are so often portrayed, this kind of structure could not have been conceived by people who were savages, or indeed primitive.
On its own, this site is a mystery, but it does hold clues, and that's something we'll see time and time again at the sites we'll be visiting. As we travel across the British Isles, we'll pick up more clues along the way, and hopefully gain a greater insight into the lives of our distant ancestors. If I was to visit all the sites there are, you'd probably still be watching this film in a year's time. This end of the country is probably the richest in its wealth of prehistoric sites. Within just a few minutes of where I am now, besides any number of standing stones and cairns, there's the Merry Maidens Stone Circle, Tregaseal Stone Circle, the Nine Maidens Stone Circle, there's Boscawenum Stone Circle, there's Pendine Valfogu, Carnuni Fogu, Chunquoit, Lanyanquoit. There's loads of them.
We'll get glimpses of as many as we can, but as well as some of the better known sites, we're going to travel to places that you may never have had the opportunity to visit, and quite a few you probably never knew existed.
You know those clues I mentioned? This isn't one of them. And to further confound you, this is not a stone circle. Every region has its idiosyncrasies, and that's what fascinates me. All across Britain, you find stone circles, standing stones, cairns, dolmens, barrows, henges. Perhaps these other structures can shed some light on the oddities, such as this one. This little monument is called Mennan Toll, and myth has it that passing through this hole can cure your ills. It's even said to aid women's fertility. People believe all sorts of things, but in reality, and you'll hear it said a lot on this journey, we just don't have a clue what it was for. What we do know is that even a modest arrangement such as Mennan Toll, leaving aside the size of some of the sites we're yet to visit, would have taken considerable time and effort to create. And that scale of time and effort could only be afforded by sizable communities. That's communities of people with a unity of thought.
Often hidden away in intimate, secluded settings, the traces of our ancestors can still be found, frozen in time. It would be easy to walk straight past these archetypal Bronze Age maze carvings, but even such small remnants give us tantalizing glimpses into both the mundane and the more mystical aspects of their lives. It's partly because we tend to look out for big, impressive monoliths that many important signs of our ancestors' day-to-day lives sometimes pass unnoticed. Here at Routor, on Bodmin Moor, the remains of a Bronze Age village is almost lost in the landscape. But a closer look reveals the true scale of the site, which was probably home to large numbers of people. Out on open moors are often the remains of what could have been huge ceremonial sites, like the three-circle complex of the hurlers, long since absorbed into religious folklore as men turned to stone for dancing on the Sabbath. Many smaller sites, like the gleaming white quartz circle further south at Dulo, can be easily missed. Tucked away behind hedges and farm walls, people pass them by unknowingly, leaving them to be appreciated only by the local inhabitants. Dartmoor is one of my favourite places in the whole of England, and I've been exploring here for over 20 years. 365 square miles of rolling moors with a huge variety of prehistoric structures. It's so unspoilt in archaeological terms that it gives us a much clearer idea of what the whole country used to be like. Miles of moorland covered in stone circles, cairns and kists, settlements, barrows, standing stones.
And these stone roads are a bit of a mystery, and Dartmoor has the greatest concentration anywhere. There's over 60 of them dotted across the moor, and of such variety they must have had lots of different functions. Here I'm at Merivale, right in the middle of Dartmoor, and this site has a bit of everything. There's settlements all around, there's hut circles over there, there's a big stone circle with a huge standing stone over there, there's cairns dotted all around, and these stone rows right in the middle of it all. And you want to see what's in the middle of this row. It's only small, but this little funereal box, called a kist, does imply that this was a processionary pathway. So what do we have here? A temple in the centre of a big community?
In many cases, the rows lead to cairns or stone circles, but of all the rows across the moor, none of them point in the same direction. Some people have theorised that they may have had astronomical alignments, but frankly, a line will always point at something, and there's so much inconsistency that the idea doesn't hold water. It seems much more likely that the rows didn't relate to anything outside the community.
But there's something else to bear in mind. These barren landscapes are entirely the work of our farming ancestors. About 12,000 years ago, the whole moor was covered in forest, and it was about this time that hunter-gatherers began felling trees to make the first clearings. The reason was simple enough. If you can encourage animals to graze in the clearings that you've made, then hunting is a much, much easier job. So people would stay around their hunting grounds, settlements would develop, until about 4,000 years ago, domestic farming had become a way of life. So did these rows lead people across open moor or through dense forest?
Up on this high ground, you get a real sense of the past. Spreading out across the landscape are all the signs of a fully rounded community.
Here we're on the southwest side of the moor, on top of Tor. Way over there in the distance is Tor, and you might just be able to make out down there the Drizzlecombe Stone Rose. These wonderful evocative names are sometimes the lingering legacy of a long forgotten history. For instance, over there behind Tor, there's a valley called Evilcombe. And I really wish I could tell you stories of black magic and ritual sacrifice, but actually the name comes from the valley's tin mining past. And an evil was just a short-handled pick that the miners used to use to extract ore from the rocks. So sorry to disappoint on that one, but still good for frightening the kids though. Let's go and have a look at those rows. You remember that little kist we saw in the middle of the road at Merivale? Well, this is a perfect Bronze Age example. It's about 4,000 years old, and basically it's a stone box, and it would have held the remains of an individual or even a family sometimes, with a cover stone, and then the whole thing would have been covered with a mound of earth called cairn. This is Yellowmead, just north of Tor, that you can probably see up there behind me. It's where we were earlier. And this place is incredibly unusual. It's a quadruple stone circle. It's strange, there's no alignments amongst the stones to suggest astronomy, and there's no central kist to suggest an elaborate burial, just these enigmatic rings. There are theories. There's supposed to have been a cairn here, but nobody knows what came first, how it developed, or what it was actually used for. And I think it looks like a target. It's village hunting practice. Nearest spear to the middle wins. That's what it is.
10 miles to the east is another oddity that leaves you wondering. This is the Greyweathers double stone circle. They're probably early Bronze Age, about 4,000 years old, and when they were excavated in 1898, both circles were found to be strewn with ashes. No one knows whether it was from cremations or domestic burning, or how old the circles were before the burning took place. They're aligned north-south, the southern circle being slightly bigger, and it's been suggested that they were a place for the gathering of the clans. But I think that's silly. You wouldn't create a neutral territory and have one side bigger than the other. We can only guess what they were for.
crazy. You go from falling over stones round every bend to really having to hunt them out. It seems strange that moving east through England, you find less and less sites, but actually it says a lot about our ancestors through the ages. When communities are successful, settlements continue to develop. People only move to new pastures when the land stops providing. And in the West Country, that's exactly what happened. Even today, there's very little building because the land just isn't hospitable. Fortunately for us, though, it means that our ancestors' hard work is still there to see. When you look at the development of societies in other countries, it's clear from places like the Great Pyramids or the Acropolis that the cities have continued to develop without enormous cultural movement. Most other cities in the world have grown through either knocking down or building over the ancient structures. In places where those ancient monuments are still there to be seen, they've lost their original meaning, but somehow they've kept a level of importance for the people. Of course, that could just be a question of wonder. You have to ask, would the Great Pyramids still be there if they'd only been 30 feet tall?
Sometimes, like Nine Stones in Dorset, our ancient monuments stand neglected by the roadside, virtually unnoticed by passing motorists and unvisited by all but the enthusiast. The passing centuries have left many ancient sites with a mysterious anonymity. We respect them, but we don't understand them, and their social importance has long since disappeared. We protect them and ignore them in equal measure. Stonehenge is a perfect example. This Bronze Age site is part of an enormous settlement that sprawls across the surrounding countryside. It's hard to see a lot of it now, but this raised mound originally rose an astonishing 17 feet out of the ditch around it. The careful placing of this Norman church would have been a very powerful way of putting an end to any earlier non-Christian goings-on. Now, its crumbling ruin sits like a weary trespasser on unguarded land.
This is the Chestnuts in Addington, Kent, and I wish I had one of these in my garden.
It's the remains of a Neolithic long barrow that was used well into the Bronze Age, and there are other sites like this in the southeast. Not far from here, the remains of another long barrow called Cauldron looks out across the open hills and moors which haven't changed much for thousands of years. But in and around towns that have been changing constantly for hundreds of years, the land has been progressively divided into smaller and smaller plots, so structures were pulled down as their relevance in society faded, no longer showing the way so much as simply in the way.
Thankfully not here, though.
It's easy to see how history covers its tracks, especially in cities. The constant redevelopment can leave few signs of buildings from decades ago, let alone hundreds or thousands of years. So you may well wonder what on earth we're doing in the middle of London and what there could possibly be to see here.
You'd be right. Absolutely nothing. Yeah, almost nothing. There is something here, unnoticed by passers-by, and all trace of its importance long forgotten. In here is the London Stone. Truth is, we don't know its origin, but we do know that it's been here for a long time, and it's actually part of a much bigger stone that was broken here in the 18th century. We also know that it's been moved back and forth across the road in the last few hundred years. But a few possible clues remain in folklore. There are stories that say that it was once part of a stone circle on this site. Others say that it was the pillar, or the top of a pillar, in Brutus's palace. It's also reputedly the stone to which all measurements were made to London. So if you see a milestone that says London 27 miles, it's to here. You know, there are thousands upon thousands of prehistoric sites around Britain, and if you just count stone circles, nothing else, just stone circles, there's nearly 1,000 of them. It's incredible that out of all those sites, most people only seem to know this one.
Now obviously, I'm not being dismissive of Stonehenge itself. Just the fact that when visitors come to marvel at the imposing monoliths, they miss the scale and significance of the entire complex. There are literally hundreds of prehistoric sites spreading for miles in all directions. Earthworks, long barrows, avenues of stones, burial sites, and the massive cursus, they all show that this was a huge, thriving community. Woodhenge, a couple of miles northeast, is the remains of a complex timber structure, probably an enclosed circular building which sat on its own raised mound, long since flattened by ploughing. West Kennet Long Barrow to the north, at 350 feet long, is the largest chambered tomb in England and Wales. And a little further north again is Silbury Hill, the biggest man-made mound in Europe. It's estimated that to build this giant would have taken 500 men working every day for 10 years. The term henge originally came from Stonehenge. In Old English it refers to the hanging stones or lintels, but it came to mean something quite different, and ironically Stonehenge itself is not, strictly speaking, a henge. Henges have a ditch inside the raised bank, but at Stonehenge the ditch lies on the outside, which implies that they had quite different functions. The true henge of this vast Wiltshire complex is Avebury. Avebury is over 20 miles north of Stonehenge, a short day's walk for our ancestors, and it is without doubt the grandest ceremonial site in Britain. Today its splendour is really only visible from the air, but when it was built it must have been a breathtaking sight. When Avebury was excavated in the early part of the 20th century, the surrounding ditch was found to have been sheer-sided and 30 feet deep. On the outside of the ditch was a wide, flat terrace running at the foot of the bank which towered 20 feet above the central earthwork. Our ancestors excavated 150,000 tons of chalk rubble to create the ditch, an immense undertaking for something clearly of immense importance. And it wasn't the only one in the region. 50 miles to the west in Somerset stands the deceptive stone circle of Stanton Drew.
It looks pretty boring, doesn't it? An enormous stone circle with a smaller outer one at each end. But its bland appearance on the landscape gives no clue as to its original scale and importance. This circle is over 100 metres across. Now in diameter that makes it second only to the vastness of Avebury. Some years ago The Ancient Monuments Laboratory of English Heritage carried out a magnetometer survey across the whole site, and what they discovered is breathtaking. Inside the circle were 9 concentric rings of wooden posts, each post a metre apart and each post a metre or more across. Now, you don't use a post a metre or more across unless you need it to be tall, and on top of that the whole site was surrounded by a ditch and a raised bank. It may have been wood, but this would have been every bit as impressive as the stone circles of Stonehenge and Avebury.
But perhaps there is a reason for the posts not to have been so tall. The design of a henge implies that the banks were for spectators. The inner terrace at Avebury adds weight to this idea, suggesting a level walkway for finding your place before climbing the bank, exactly as we still do at arenas today. There would be no sense in having posts so tall that they obscured the spectator's view, and they need only be the height of a man for the audience to see the whole spectacle from their raised position on the massive bank. So why create an artificial forest where spectators could see, but participants could not? For me, the most likely answer is blood sports. And shocking as that may sound to many, it's important to remember that this was a time when most of Britain was covered in forest, and the most skilled hunter would probably have been held in high esteem, possibly even beyond his own community. The deep ditch would stop animals escaping into the crowd, while the forest of posts would create an enclosed but nevertheless real hunting ground. And then again, this amount of huge posts could easily have supported a floor, exactly the same design concept as at the great Colosseum of Rome, but preceding it by thousands of years. We can only wonder.
With the extraordinary variety of sites in the region, many of them of such immense size, I think this whole area of Wiltshire through Somerset must have been the capital of prehistoric Britain. And there's another important aspect of these chalk lands. That's that where there's chalk, there's flint, the very basis of prehistoric currency. Imagine a land where the slag heaps you create, your building rubble, is full of money. With the raw materials for axe making under their feet, the people of Wiltshire would have had enormous wealth. There was a huge cultural shift in the Bronze Age. The increase in farming and settlement building meant that for the first time, people had to defend their territory, and so the warrior culture was born, and with it, the use of horses. Now, when the Uffington White Horse was excavated in the early 1980s, both it and the hill fort alongside were both dated to the late Bronze Age. Now, you only need to look at the Spanish conquistadors' decimation of South America to see what a few warriors on horseback can do. These really were rich and powerful people.
As communities grew, inevitably rituals became progressively more elaborate, and burial grounds like Pretty Nine Barrows illustrate the huge significance they held for the community. Even today, the very word barrow still holds a ghostly place in folklore. Like any graveyard, there's a sense of walking amongst the dead. Over time, the whole relationship between the living and the dead became more structured, giving rise to sophisticated temples in a variety of building styles. This part of England is characterised by the 7 Cotswold style of tomb, and some of them are wonderfully preserved. Some, like Stony Littleton, have burial chambers which are accessed from within a low central passageway. Excavations seem to suggest that the chambers in this style of tomb were specific to age and gender of the dead, children buried in the first chamber on the left, sweeping clockwise with adult males in the end chamber, with the old being buried in the chamber closest to the entrance on the right. Wayland's Smithy is a much grander construction with huge stones forming the imposing forecourt. It was developed over a long period of time. The mound we still see today was actually built over an earlier mortuary house made of timber. Others, like Bellasnapp in the Cotswolds, have external burials along the side walls, but with the same meticulous attention to design and location. They certainly pick beautiful places to lay their loved ones to rest.
Did you know, Blake's rousing Jerusalem might never have been written if it weren't for these, the Rollright stones in Oxfordshire. It may come as a surprise to know that much of Blake's art and writing was inspired by the ideas of an 18th century clergyman and friend of Isaac Newton.
William Stukely was secretary to the Society of Antiquaries when he visited this place, and apparently he had a life-changing experience. His visit brought him to believe that the sites were religious and ritual centres built in ancient times by the Druids. Stukely meticulously catalogued, described and illustrated so many of our ancient monuments, bringing them firmly to public attention, and it's fair to say that their mystical importance and place in our hearts is entirely due to him. His passion led him to adopt the grandiose title of Archdruid Kindernax, ultimately inspiring the eccentric artist and poet William Blake to write his famous hymn. Jerusalem is actually about rekindling Druid culture in Britain.
This place is a wonderful concoction of historical confusion. There's names and dates all over the place. There's tales of witchcraft and kingly fighting, and no sense to be made of any of it. It is a complicated site. On the other side of the road from the circle, there's a big outlier called the King's Stone, and on the other side of the field over there is a very forlorn-looking dolmen called the Whispering Knights. The name Rollrights originates from Viking times, when it was called Hrolla Landrit, which meant the land with special rights belonging to Hrolla. And apart from being a landowner, we don't really know anything about him. And then it was thought to refer to a Norman called Roland, who fought a battle here. Except that the battle near here happened in 916 AD, and Roland died in 778.
Then, perhaps the most tenacious myth of all, there's the story of Danish King Rollo. You see, the land on which the stones stand was actually owned by a witch, and one day, while passing through, Rollo and his trusty knights found themselves confronted by the crone. She said to King Rollo, "7 long strides shalt thou take. If long Compton thou canst see, King of England thou shalt be." "Stick, stock, stone," said Rollo, "as King of England I shall be known." And he took his 7 strides, but the view was hidden by the slight rise of the ground. The witch screeched with laughter, "As Long Compton thou canst not see, King of England thou shalt not be. Rise up, stick, and stand still, stone, for King of England thou shalt be none. Thou and thy men hoar stones shall be, and I myself an elden tree."
Which all sounds very mean and self-destructive to me. Ironically, if Rollo's legs had been a bit longer, then his strides may well have shown him the village of Long Compton in the valley below. Instead, he and his men turn to stone and remain as we see them today. Although people do say that some nights they uproot themselves and go down to drink in the stream in the valley below.
So what do we know? Aside from the tales of witchcraft which persist to this day, it's generally accepted that the stones were erected about 5,000 years ago, and excavations here have uncovered Bronze Age burials, cremations, a couple of flint tools and an urn.
But perhaps most significant of all is its location. Sitting on the Cotswold Ridgeway, the Rollrights were probably, for thousands of years, a really important place on what could be the oldest trade route in the country. Trading in flint tools, pottery, livestock, textiles was probably very well established, and this was probably a major link between southern England and the whole of the rest of Britain.
Our standing stones belong to an age long before British territories were established, and there's something very evocative about crossing a national border that didn't exist in those ancient times. Wales appears to have far fewer megalithic remains than some other parts of Britain, but that may be simply because they're harder to reach, and many of them in inaccessible places are forgotten and unnamed. But those that have had an enduring place in people's imagination owe much to the richness of Welsh folklore. The Pontypridd rocking stone has been a meeting place for as long as we know, and it has strong connections with the Welsh bardic tradition. Interestingly though, the stone circle around it was constructed by bards in 1849, and that made me wonder. Very occasionally, we still build stone circles in a kind of homage to our distant ancestors, but with no real knowledge of their original purpose. How do we know that half of the British circles aren't Bronze Age follies built in homage to their Neolithic ancestors with no knowledge of their intent? Tinkinswood is another example of a Seven Cotswold tomb, and this enormous Neolithic monument is home to the largest capstone in Britain, 30 feet long and weighing around 50 tons. Folklore says that if you fall asleep here, you will wake as a bard, or go mad. Although with some of the bards I've met, I'm not sure it isn't the same thing. Out in the wilder countryside, the open moorlands echo the barren landscapes of Dartmoor, and everything seems to disappear into the vast openness of it all. Above the River Tor, if it weren't for the massive standing stone called Main Moor, you could easily miss the circle of Cerrig-Dorn. But however unimpressive the circle may be, its position looking down through the valleys is spectacular.
This is Gorse Vawr in Pembrokeshire, and it's typical of Welsh stone circles. They're all made of small stones, which is really strange because you see that ridge up there behind me? Well, that's the Presely's, right? Now I can tell you from the wonders of GPS technology that Stonehenge is 135 miles from here. You know the blue stones at Stonehenge? They came from up there. What were they thinking?
It may be another good example of the possible remnants of old oral traditions that Merlin appears in Welsh folklore and is the reputed builder of Stonehenge long before his emergence as a wizard in romantic Arthurian legend. These faint strands could connect to an age far older than we imagine. Dolmens punctuate the landscape in this part of Wales, although here they're usually called cromlechs and are all that remain of much bigger structures. Not far from the Presely's, the tiny Llech Tripeth stands lonely on a hilltop, and its small size makes it difficult to imagine what it may have looked like. But a few miles to the south, Pentre Ifan is so huge that it takes a tall man to reach its enormous capstone. And these stones were covered by a long mound of earth and stones which stretched about 100 feet down the hill behind it. Further north, in a village called Ysbyty Cynfyn, not far from Aberystwyth, is an incongruous site illustrating the struggle between ancient belief and Christianity. The once powerful stone circle has been absorbed into the walls of the church graveyard, very much like the church sitting on top of Stonehenge in Dorset. The early church clearly recognised the greater impact of using the site for something new rather than destroying it. In contrast, the unspoilt circle of Moeltyrchaf sits majestically on a hill looking out across the landscape just as it has for millennia. And sites like this highlight an aspect of these monuments which is often overlooked. They look similar, but this is a circle of stones forming an almost unbroken enclosure, clearly different from a stone circle where the stones are widely spaced and each has a deliberate placing. High in the hills overlooking Conway Bay sits a site called the Druids' Circle. All through Wales, links with the Druids seems to grow stronger, and here it's not without reason. Although little is known about them, we do know that in Celtic tradition the Druids were already long established by 200 BC. To the rest of society, these revered teachers clearly held a special status, and from the later accounts of Julius Caesar, referring to the Druids in Gaul, we find that they were exempt from all normal taxes and obligations.
Interestingly, when it came to electing a successor for the position of Supreme Druid, if it couldn't be resolved by vote, it was decided by armed force. So much for peaceful mistletoe pickers. The Roman invasion of Britain was ruthless, and as they forged their way north, the opposing Brits, along with the Druids, were forced to retreat ahead of them through Wales. And it was AD 60 that everything came to a head. Rome had to overcome the troublesome Druids if it was going to achieve total control of Britain. It was here on the Isle of Anglesey that the Druids made their last stand against the might of the Roman Empire. And contemporary accounts tell of a people far removed from the peaceful white-robed mystics imagined by Stukely. The final battle started here at the Menai Strait. The Roman army arrived at the riverbank over there and looked across to a terrifying sight. Tacitus described the enemy as a dense array of armed warriors. He said, women in black with dishevelled hair were dashing between the ranks like furies and waving brands. Druids with their arms in the air yelling curses at the Roman army. He says that the soldiers were paralysed with fear. But nonetheless, the Romans won. And the Druids' mythical status today is the legacy of that once powerful force. And who knows what body of knowledge died with them.
One needs to remember that despite our perception of the Druidic links with stone circles and ancient monuments, these sites were built long before we hear anything about the existence of Druids. For example, on Anglesey is the profoundly mystical Barclodaya de Gaures, about 5,000 years old. A circular structure which leaves no doubt that it was a significant setting for ritual practices. There are what appear to be burial chambers to the sides, although only one was found to contain human remains. Stones positioned within the tomb bear strange carvings, and strangest of all, archaeologists have found that in the central area a fire had burned for a long time, into the middle of which had been poured a stew.
A stew containing eel, wrasse, whiting, rabbit, mouse, shrew, snake, frog and toad. Now, easy as it is for us to associate such a recipe with a Shakespearean witch's brew, actually there is another interesting possibility. These people seem to be fascinated by creatures that live in the margins of the natural world. Creatures that live underground, where man would only place the dead, or in water where man couldn't exist at all, or only coming out at night when the veils between the living and the dead seem to be lifted. In the mind of Neolithic man, could these creatures have seemed to pass between the worlds of the living and the dead? However we interpret this remarkable find, discovering these organic remains has given us a unique glimpse into the ritual lives of our ancestors. Soup?
This is Bryn Celli, and it really is one of the most significant sites in Britain. Its history is long and very complex, and there's been a lot of debate over its construction. About 5,000 years ago, it was a henge, complete with ditch and bank, and to emphasize its importance, the central area was crowned by a circle of big stones. Then about 1,000 years later, it was turned into a huge chambered cairn, far bigger than is visible today. The ditch was filled, and earth from the bank was used to provide material for the earth mound, and to make the tomb, the circle stones were moved and reused, or broken and buried in a total destruction of what had been before. Another example of a total change of usage, a place being taken over completely and changed from an open place for the living into an enclosed place for the dead. In a way, it's like the stone circle of Ysbyty Cynfyn being absorbed into the walls of a later Christian graveyard, and it's possibly our best example of the underlying complexity at any site that was used for thousands of years.
Got to be honest with you, I came here yesterday, and I thought that when I got to Anglesey, I'd tell you about the Druids and show you a couple of sites and go. But I found something here that I really can't understand how it's been missed before, and it's genuinely the most exciting thing I've ever discovered, and yesterday it left me stunned for hours. Come and have a look at this. This is the burial chamber, and here stands an impressive pillar of stone. It doesn't touch the ceiling, so it's not structural. It's important in its own right. Now, archaeological texts and writings about this site have described this as a monolith and as a carefully dressed pillar of stone, meaning it was cut to be this shape. But you can't cut these textures. So what could be cylindrical and this rough texture? It's a fossil tree trunk. Look, you can see where the bark has split, revealing the wood grain underneath. All around you can see traces of that. Now, don't switch off when I say what I'm going to say next. Some of these cut marks can only have been made when it was wood, not when it was stone. Look here, the bark has dragged. Stone would have split or shattered. And down here, two distinct marks, blows, where the wood has pulped. And you can't make these marks in stone unless it's something like a mudstone, but in that case you won't get these textures. Now you'll either think I'm crazy or you'll be as stunned as I was yesterday, because as far as I was concerned, the latest fossil wood comes from the Miocene period, which is about 20 million years ago. I sat on the floor, stunned and confused, and then rang a friend of mine who knows about these things, and apparently the latest research from Japan has proved that petrification, so that's turning into stone, can occur much faster than we thought, and it is conceivable that a piece of wood this size could petrify in under a century. But that's in extreme conditions. Now, even if we give it a few thousand years, we still have a wonderful story. We could have a tree trunk that has been worked by man. It falls into a bog with a high acid content and a high silica content, and over that period of time it turns to stone. Now when it was found again, it must have seemed like a thing of absolute magic. To Neolithic man, wood symbolized life and stone symbolized death. So here was a being of life and afterlife, living and dead. Whether it was found by the builders of Bryn Celyn or whether it was brought here from elsewhere, already a highly prized item, we may never know. I'm just amazed that nobody has written about this before, and I hope that specialists get here to date it, and soon, because if it is 20 million years old, I don't know what I'll do.
Ireland. This really is the land of fairy tales. Any turn in the road might reveal a sight so beautiful that your heart skips a beat. It's hard to know where to start. Until you see Castle Ruddery. Even as stone circles go, this looks a bit of a mess, but underneath its tired appearance lies a site as complex as Stanton Drew or Bryn Celyn. Known as a circle henge, the stones are surrounded by a raised bank, and excavations showed it to have been built using soil from a ditch lying 24 feet outside the circle. And if that wasn't impressive enough, the excavations also revealed that the whole thing was surrounded by another bank which was supported by a wall of wooden posts. But even with all of that, it isn't what excited me about this site. Until I came here, I didn't know when or where I was going to talk about a particular obsession of mine: drill holes. Drill holes are a fairly common feature around megalithic monuments, and it's always intrigued me that no one really discusses them. One of the things that makes them so enigmatic is that in the main they all appear to be worked with the same size of tool. They've been dismissed by some as being worked in the last few hundred years by stonemasons attempting to split and clear stones from the land. Now obviously some of them could be exactly that, but drilled stones litter the landscape across Devon and Cornwall, with many of them still in positions which bear no relation to possible clearing. And even though these are atypical examples, here at Castle Ruddery there's evidence that I have good reason to be excited by this apparently minor detail. Firstly, this stone, close to the white quartz entrance stones, is drilled to create an elegant curved edge. The other half of it lies outside the circle, but clearly has nothing to do with clearing. And secondly, but most significantly, this stone lying to one side of the circle has 5 carefully worked slots for who knows what purpose. The thing is that I know an identical stone lying in a similar position in another circle, back on Dartmoor in southwest England at a place called Fernworthy. It would be extraordinary if these stones were not cut and positioned for the same purpose. So we may have another piece of evidence for a shared ritual or practice that we know nothing about. Ireland has such a variety of megalithic monuments, some of them extraordinary for their audacity. Like Brownshill Dolmen near Carlow in the southeast, its immense capstone is the biggest in Europe and is estimated to weigh between 100 and 150 tons. Others like Labercalee near Fermoy are extraordinary in their design. This looks more like a prehistoric diner to me. It's not surprising that Ireland is so steeped in fairy lore. When you see sites like the beautifully elegant Circle of Ardgroom with its tall, slender stones, it's really hard not to imagine it filled with equally tall and slender robed figures. And utterly magical sites that, because of their settings chosen so carefully by their builders, seem to exist in another world altogether, like Urach, standing timelessly on the banks of a lake, facing a waterfall which cascades down from the hills on the far shore.
Have a look at this. Here's a map of a tiny area in the south. And I'm not even going to bother to open it all out. Okay, standing stone, boulder burial, stone circle, megalithic tomb, boulder burial, cross inscribed stone, boulder burial, standing stone, stone circle, boulder burial, megalithic tomb, standing stone. A map of a tiny area in the north. Cairns, megalithic tomb, pick anywhere. Megalithic tomb, standing stone, megalithic tomb, standing stone, stone circle, stone row, megalithic tomb. They are everywhere. Over the whole of Ireland, there are 1,500 megalithic sites. That's the big stone stuff. I don't want to keep tossing the list at you, but if we do count the cairns and the barrows and all that stuff as well, there are an incredible 5,000 recorded archaeological sites in County Sligo alone. Now the point is that here, as we saw on Dartmoor for example, there's been comparatively little building, so the traces of our ancestors are still clear to see. Now, even allowing for the variations in population density, if there are 5,000 sites in County Sligo alone, how many thousand must there have been across the whole of Britain and Ireland?
Having seen from the maps just how many sites cover the Irish landscape, picking any road in the southwest seems to lead to something worth visiting. Here the circle of Shroan-Birain with its tall portal stones sits isolated off the road, almost oppressed by the ominous rock face behind it. It's amazing how the atmosphere of a place is so influenced by its position. In total contrast to Shroan-Birain, the portal dolmen of Poulnabrone in County Galway stands proudly under open skies which seem to link it far more to the heavens than the earth. Earlier I mentioned that there are 5,000 recorded archaeological sites in County Sligo. Well, out of all those places in Sligo, there's one area which stands out from all the rest. This is Carrowmore, Ireland's largest megalithic cemetery. It's amongst the oldest and largest megalithic cemeteries in Europe, and the dates here are staggering. Earliest remains have been dated back to around 9,600 years ago, and the earliest megalithic tombs here to about 7,000 years ago.
So to put that in perspective, that's a very, very long time before any of the Great Pyramid building in Egypt. You see that lump up there behind me? That's Knocknarea. It's the sacred mountain that dominates the surrounding lowlands. And you see that bump on the very top? That's where we're going next.
Knocknarea is not alone amongst the surrounding mountains in having a huge cairn at its summit. But this colossal monument is called Maeve's Cairn, and there really was an Iron Age Queen Maeve who could be buried here. Even though the cairn itself predates Maeve by a couple of thousand years, tombs were commonly reused for long periods, so it is possible.
Irish mythology tells of people who came from over the sea, and noble figures like the kings of Tara, the kings of Tuatha De Danann, and here, Queen Maeve. You know, whoever does lie here, they must have been held in the very highest esteem to be buried at such a site. We'd probably mostly agree that man is an animal trying to solve the problems of living comfortably with his environment. And you probably hear people say quite often that man no longer lives in harmony with his environment. But actually that's a mistake. Man lives in total harmony with his environment. He just happens to have created a completely artificial one over which he has far greater control. The accurate thing to say would be that urbanized man no longer lives in harmony with nature. Now this is essentially how we lost our connection with our ancestors. The stories and myths passed down for thousands of years ceased to have meaning for a people so far removed from nature. Now in Britain, the combination of Roman invasion and centuries of religious dogma destroyed or absorbed, sometimes confused that earlier heritage, as is so clear to see at places like Stonehenge, for example, or as Cunvin. Adopt it into the present, and it ceases to have the past that you so wish to hide. It only takes a few centuries of being told how and what to think and believe for almost all traces of a word-of-mouth tradition to disappear. So cultural heritage had to start all over again. The problem now is that our artificial environment maintains that separation from our ancestors, and the speed of change through our technological advances means that few figures in history hold their meaning. Who were the mythical kings of Tara, the kings of Tuatha De Danann and Queen Maeve? We cling to the heroic tales of King Arthur, of Robin Hood, because they remind us of the values that we hold dear: love, honour, bravery, nobility. But historical figures don't fit so easily into an ever-evolving culture. There's really only one way to find modern-day heroes who will fit into a culture undergoing constant change. We create celebrities.
It's interesting that as you move north through Ireland, the sights seem to become grander and more sophisticated. Still in County Sligo, the court cairn of Creevykeel is one of the finest examples of this type of structure. The open area has a puzzling circular construction with its own passage entrance, perhaps a kind of pulpit, where the priest could make a grand entrance when the congregation was settled in the wider area of the court. Beyond this lies what would have been the covered tomb itself, still guarded by imposing portal stones. Bigmore, near Londonderry, seems more like a showpiece of Bronze Age architectural design. The circles here are laid out in pairs, each pair having its own cairn and approaching stone rows. The overall sense of establishment, refinement of old rituals is almost tangible, especially at the most famous group of Ireland's prehistoric monuments, Knowth, Dowth and Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. Sadly, Dowth is little more than a ruin, long since ravaged by quarrying, but Knowth and Newgrange hold a level of artistry which leaves you speechless. These Neolithic masterpieces show a level of sophistication which is impossible to take in on a single visit. Both Newgrange and Knowth are colossal monuments in themselves, each surrounded by numerous chambered tombs. Each also has its own crowning feature. Newgrange is meticulously built and aligned so that its gently rising passageway coincides with the angle of the sun's rays when they shine through the opening above the entrance. At the winter solstice, the sunlight reaches up the passageway to illuminate the central chamber. Knowth is notable for an entirely different reason. The whole site is adorned with decorated stones. In fact, Knowth alone accounts for over a quarter of all the known megalithic art in Europe. I couldn't leave Ireland without saying something else about Newgrange.
From up here, it does look spectacular, but actually it's both a marvel and a monstrosity. Inside it's original. It's an awesome display of Neolithic sophistication. Creating that internal space that's only illuminated by the sun at winter solstice has to have been done with a fantastic understanding of astronomy. It really is worth a visit. But outside, it's a lie. Neolithic man would never have built that monster. That gleaming white quartz facade conceals a concrete wall, the only way that that design would stay standing. And all around, above the curbstones, there are concrete plinths that support the weight of the mound. Even the entrance, it's designed to take huge numbers of visitors. The court would never have looked like that. It's a 1970s piece of nonsense. Come and marvel at the inside, but ignore the outside. It's just not true.
Halfway between Ireland and England, lying peacefully in the middle of the Irish Sea, is perhaps the best kept secret of the British Isles. Aside from being a beautiful island, the Isle of Man is steeped in history and folklore. To this day, it remains politically independent and is home to the oldest unbroken parliament in the world. The Tynwald was a meeting place for the clans and has had many reputed sites around the island throughout history. Even today it maintains its ancient political rituals at Tynwald Hill, looking every bit a prehistoric mound in the town of St John's. This deeply held respect for heritage means that ancient sites often add to the sense of place, accepted and protected in intimate proximity to modern houses. It's also home to some unique prehistoric sites which clearly show a shared culture with the British Isles, but are individual in their design and layout. On open moorlands, overlooking the sea, across the hillsides and in secluded woods, the signs of ancient sites remain.
If you saw a hut circle marked on a map, you probably wouldn't bother to even come and have a look. But without coming to explore, where on earth would you find a site like this? It's marked as just a hut circle, which implies that it's just the footings of a building where somebody lived. But if it's true that this is how our ancestors built their houses, then why aren't there thousands of them all over the landscapes? You have to wonder, is it possible that it was where maybe a holy man lived on the outskirts of a village? Or maybe just somebody really antisocial who didn't want to have anything to do with anybody else?
Over on the southwest tip of the island is an extraordinary site called Mull Hill. It's hard to imagine how this would have looked in its day, but the circle of cairns laid out in pairs with numerous entrances hints at elaborate rituals under an open sky and with clear views to the setting sun. Many of the island's monuments are positioned looking out to sea, and sometimes the most unimposing site can turn out to be quite special.
Of all the sites in the world that I've visited, this is one of my personal favourites. It's listed as just a cairn, but it's an excellent example of why we shouldn't take things for granted. And you can see on closer inspection why it can't just be a burial site. Have a look at this. This place is unique. It's a white quartz box. These walls and ceiling are huge blocks of white quartz. And the thing is that they're not at the centre of the cairn, which is where a traditional burial would be. They're at the back. This place is intimate. It's really intimate. It is more than just a burial chamber.
Another feature of this mound can also be seen across Britain, and that's the small ditch and raised bank running around its perimeter. To me it seems likely that they shared the same function as the banks at the great henges, the perfect height for seating, to watch a priest minister to his flock or whatever ritual was taking place on the mound.
This is Castell-in-Ard, one of the most important sites on the whole of the Isle of Man. It's about 4,000 years old, and it's a great example of how our perceptions can become distorted and the impressions that we get can be a bit misleading. We can be forgiven for thinking that you find somewhere like this in the landscape in an isolated place, and it would have been maybe a small community living somewhere. But when you think about it, the manpower necessary to create a site of this size must have been immense. When we're just left with the bare bones of a building, it can sometimes be very hard to imagine what it must have looked like when it was fully intact. Big, isn't it? This is something you don't see every day. We're used to sites being isolated because the needs of communities change and they move to new ground. But you find a place like this and you can see that people have been living on this very spot for 5,000 years or more.
Laxey isn't a big town. Even today its population is still only around 2,000 inhabitants. But nevertheless, its status as a successful settlement is clear.
And this site is huge. It's probably one of the biggest of its kind in the whole of the British Isles. The other half of it is way behind the house on the other side of the road over there. This whole site is called King Orry's Grave in Laxey, and if it was one site when it was built, with this central row of burial chambers running right through to the other side, it's even bigger than at Castell-in-Ard that we were looking at before. So it must have been for a big community, and it must have been a very important site.
Perhaps the important point to note from the Isle of Man is that even on a small island, we can see evidence of communities which were big enough and stable enough either to have daily sustenance sufficiently under control that they had the time to build such sites, or that the community was big enough for some people to be dedicated to the task of building.
Coming down the timeline of history, inevitably there are crossovers between archaeology and geology, but it is important not to blur the edges. Archaeology tells us about how our ancestors lived, what they did, what they left behind, but geology tells us about the land on which they lived. In archaeological terms, what we broadly call the Stone Age began way back, 2.5 million years ago, in the Paleolithic. And astonishingly, with this simple tool use, it was well over 1 million years before man realised that it was a good idea to hit stones with stones. The development was really slow. We have to come way, way down, closer to the present day, to the Neolithic period, which started incredibly only 8,000 years ago, when our building work began. That lasted until the beginning of the Bronze Age, only 4,500 years ago. Now all this sits within a geological period called the Holocene, which started 10,000 years ago. So all the work that we know of, all the ancient sites, all the megalithic tomb building, that all happened in this small time frame in the Holocene period. Now here in the Holocene beds at Formby Point, north of Liverpool, something truly wonderful is happening. The sea here has washed away thousands of years of sand, uncovering a 6,000-year-old beach, baked so hard by the sun over a long dry period that when the tide next brought sands over to cover it, it just rested gently on top, protecting every mark that had been made by people. This isn't rock, this is just baked hard ancient sand. So the sea is gradually washing it away. These won't be here for long. They have found children's footprints and animals' footprints here too. So the man who left these prints could have been out hunting with his children. It's wonderful to think that he could have stood on this spot, watching his children play or watching the sun go down. It's fantastic.
Arbor Low in the Peak District is another fabulous henge. It may be smaller in size than the enormous henges of Avebury and Stanton Drew, but is nonetheless impressive for it. The inner mound stone circle is long fallen, either through centuries of high winds or perhaps religious destruction, but in use all those thousands of years ago, it must have been a wonderful sight. Stanton Moor in Derbyshire is home to an enormous Bronze Age cemetery, and its focal point of the Nine Ladies stone circle stands on what would have been open high ground. The early morning mists seem to give it an even greater mystery, but 9 stones, so often we see 9 stones. Near Clitheroe in Lancashire, Bleasdale Circle is another mysterious site, but very important for us in our journey. You may have wondered why I'm not travelling much into the east of the country, and Bleasdale is a good illustration of the reason. This small arrangement of concrete cylinders marks the post holes that have been found here, and this is all that can be seen of a much bigger and complicated site which spread into the surrounding field. The geology of Britain has created an almost rockless swathe across much of eastern England, and this meant that here our ancestors had no choice but to use wood to build all their important sites, which have long since rotted away, leaving no visible trace above ground. Imagine what the flat lowlands of England might have looked like, covered in wooden versions of stone circles. How many Woodhenges and Stanton Drews might there have been, waiting to be rediscovered? The early church often used standing stones to put the fear of God into the hearts of the lowly people of the parish. All over the country you find sites which still bear the names they were given to frighten the would-be sinner. The Merry Maidens, the Nine Maidens, the Hurlers, the Nine Ladies of Stanton Moor, all turned to stone for doing something ungodly on a Sunday.
You know, really bad things like dancing or playing a happy tune. And here, even more scary, the devil apparently threw this stone in an attempt to destroy the church and missed. But aside from early superstitions, what do we have here? This is the Rudston monolith. It's the tallest standing stone in Britain, nearly 26 feet tall, and if you apply the rule of thumb for big monoliths, that there's a quarter again in the ground, this stone is between 32 and 35 feet long, and they brought it from Caton over 10 miles away. Now obviously you don't go to that amount of effort without a reason. And here around Rudston may well have been as important to our Bronze Age ancestors as the mighty Stonehenge and Avebury. Only traces remain, but almost invisible in the landscape are the remains of the most enigmatic of prehistoric monuments, the Cursus.
Imagine a henge, a circular area surrounded by a ditch with a raised bank on the outside. And then imagine that idea as a straight line. That's the basic structure of a cursus, and they were clearly of immense importance. There are a number to be found across Britain, varying from the shortest example in Northampton, 200 yards long, through the Stonehenge cursus, which is nearly 2 miles long, to the awesome Dorset cursus, which stretches for 6 miles. It's 300 feet wide, and the builders shifted an incredible 6.5 million cubic feet of chalk in its construction. And I wonder if the processionary passway of the Tynwald on the Isle of Man is a living example of the same structure. Every July the 5th on Tynwald Day, the world's oldest parliament walks between the raised banks in a procession to the stepped mound at the end. Here, new laws are proclaimed and the people gather to seek justice and air their grievances. Around Rudston, there were at least 4 cursus monuments, and it may not be coincidental that this site lies pretty close to halfway up mainland Britain. A national meeting place, perhaps?
Theories about the purpose of these huge structures vary greatly, but I favour the slightly controversial idea that they're the precursors to the athletics track. The feature of the raised bank would certainly have given clear views to spectators, and the fact there are often burials adjacent to them does nothing to negate the theory. Even today, we still play cricket and hold sports days on the field by the church. We're often so wrapped up in the spiritual side of our ancestors, we forget that a fundamental to all species, especially humans, is competition. After all, the Greek Olympics and the Roman arenas didn't spring from nowhere. Evidence? Absolutely none. I just wish they'd uncover some chalk lines running the full length of one. There's a common misconception about our Neolithic and Bronze Age ancestors, that they always lived around their settlements and never really went very far from home. But you remember way back at the Rollright Stones in Oxfordshire, I mentioned the trade routes across Britain. And believe it or not, some of the best evidence we have for the scale of that trade is up there, on the top of Langdale Pike in Cumbria. This is local stone. It is found in a few other places not far from here, most of them a lot easier to get to, and you have to wonder why our ancestors chose this remote and inaccessible spot as a centre for their axe-making industry.
The thing is that this stone produced axe heads of such quality that they were highly prized and desired items. How do we know? Because axes from this very spot have been found as far afield as Ireland, Scotland, southern England, and more than anywhere else, way over in the east in Lincolnshire. Some have even been found completely unused in burials and religious sites. The significance of Lincolnshire is that it's a place with little local stone. The people in the east would have needed to buy these. And what price a beautiful axe? A pig? A cow? A pottery urn?
So did people bring their items here to exchange them, or were the axes carried all over Britain by traders? The truth is, we don't actually know how the trading took place. The important thing is that it did.
In the region all around the Langdale Axe Factory, there are suggestions of a level of wealth similar to the flintlands of Wiltshire. The small Druid circle of Ulverston, also known as the Druids' Temple on Birkrigg Common to the south of Langdale, looks unassuming but is all that remains of a circle which must have been quite beautiful. There used to be an outer circle, now all but invisible, but the circles once stood on a stone pavement, and the inner area was cobbled with a bluish stone that wasn't local. It seems that this carefully designed construction, with its open views across Morecambe Bay, was more elegant than cheap. In sharp contrast, closer to the axe factory, things were far less subtle. Enormous show sites were built in an overt display of wealth and power. Sunkenkirk to the southwest originally contained 60 stones in its impressive circle, and excavations found that the ground had been completely levelled in preparation for its construction. And to the north, one of my favourite circles in the whole of Britain, Castlerigg near Keswick in the Lake District, stands in a breathtaking setting. Whilst it may just as easily have been an axe market, the abiding impression here is of a vast cathedral where the mountains themselves are a part of the grand design. Moving away from the lakes, to the northeast near Penrith stands another giant amongst stone circles, In fact, Long Meg and her daughters is the 6th largest in the whole of Britain, with an incredible 70 stones still standing. It's possible that Long Meg, the tall outlier, was standing before the circle was built alongside, but it's hard to know for sure.
There's a lot of debate about inscribed stones, but I do have to wonder if they're not maps. There are 3 rings here. There's a big one here that you probably can't see in this light, but we have this big circle here, huge circle. There used to be a circle over there, and there still is another circle over there. So we have these 3 circles that maybe illustrate that. If you look at places like Knowth, for example, in Ireland, where some of the engravings are really intricate, but again show shapes that can relate to some of the structures that we see in the landscape. I've spent a certain amount of time with the Kogi Indians who live in the jungles of northern Colombia, and they are the descendants of, and effectively remain to this day, a Neolithic culture. Now, at the entrance to one of their cities in the jungles, they have a huge stone that could be 1,000, 1,500 years old, covered with engravings. Now, they call it the map stone, and it shows the layout of the city as it spreads into the jungle. And I think when you look at these rings, knowing what we know now about Stanton Drew, about the post holes and these concentric rings of posts, and that more and more post holes are being found at different sites, I do have to wonder, are these rings actually showing that there were concentric rings within this site as well?
Our first site across the border into Scotland is coincidentally the 7th largest circle in Britain. The 12 apostles used to be 18 or so, but sadly today only 5 remain. However unexciting this circle looks today, it must have held huge amounts of people. But moving further into Scotland, the variety of sites have echoes of others far away across Britain. Down in the southwest of Scotland, Cairn Holy is an impressive chambered cairn which is reminiscent of places like Wayland's Smithy and Cashtel in Ard. A little further north, the Circle of Glenquicken with its huge central monolith seems to share its design with Boscawen in Cornwall. And then up near Kilmartin in Argyll, the wealth of engraved stones with cup and ring markings share a number of characteristics with others we saw at Long Meg in Cumbria and Knowth in Ireland.
I don't know. See, sunrise is over there. And each of these channels faces more or less in that direction. I've got a sun compass here. If I put that down, now, see, each of these does line up with a sunrise at varying times of year. Now, it might be total nonsense, but on the other hand, it might not. Ironically, there is one that is slightly off the scale, but do you throw the idea away because of one, or did they have a reason for making it different? We will never know. It's very easy to underestimate the meticulous and painstaking job done by archaeologists, and people often misinterpret what they're actually saying about their findings. For example, a place is called a burial site because there are signs of ritual burial, that an individual was held in high esteem or affection. But on that basis, would we call this a burial site? The thing is that archaeologists are saying we'll call this a burial site because that's what we know. Anything else may be possible, but it's conjecture. And then there's a very real problem with dating. Many Neolithic and Bronze Age tombs were constantly reused over huge periods of time. Now you can date the remains that you find, but does that necessarily date the site? Let's say that in 5,000 years' time, our descendants are excavating Westminster Abbey. Well, Edward the Confessor was buried there in 1066, and we still bury royalty and eminent figures there today. Our descendants need only excavate the newer remains to date the Abbey wrongly by 1,000 years. And how about interpretation? Let's say the same archaeologists start excavating our churches and pulling out tiny scraps of information. They find that all Christian churches are aligned east-west, a clear reference to the sun's movement in the sky. Then they find that there was a big celebration called Christmas, which was always held around the winter solstice, and another called Easter that was always held close to the spring equinox. Then from jumbled texts they find that the ritual day was on a Sunday, and that Jesus was always referred to as the Son of God. On what basis would they not think that Jesus was a sun god? And then we're confronted by a place like this. I'm in the area around Kilmartin in Argyll, and rarely is there more scope for confusion. This whole area was in use for thousands of years, with clear signs of development and reuse over all that time, and some of the details are virtually impossible to interpret with any degree of certainty. For instance, were these cup and ring markings made on a flat-lying stone like those at Cairn Barn and Achnabrech, and then erected here to stand as this imposing megalith long after the original significance of the markings had been forgotten? And then here, the great X, not a mile up the road, has precise alignments with features on the horizon which strongly imply that its function was a lunar observatory. And then over there is a linear cemetery, a number of cairns in a line stretching nearly 2 miles across the countryside with a standing stone at the end. It's a real gift for the ley line hunter searching for networking lines of energy across the landscape. I have to say that whilst I don't in any way dismiss the many energetic experiences people have at ancient monuments, the more I see of these sites, the more I'm faced by their practicality and function. And to me, there is nothing mysterious about line of sight. If you can see one site from any other, you can orientate yourself and know which way to travel. And then, still within the same complex, we find the bewildering site of Templewood. Archaeologists would never have found this circle if they hadn't been excavating the larger one over there, because it was completely hidden by the peaty soils that cover the valley floor. Now we know that there was a timber structure here first. The post holes are marked by these concrete cylinders, and their positions do imply an astronomical function. Then they started to build a stone circle here. Stones are long gone now. But before it was completed, they built the larger circle over there, and they never came back to finish this one. Imagine it snows and somebody builds a snowman in the time-honoured way of a lovely carrot for his nose and 2 lumps of coal for his eyes, and then the warmer weather comes and the snowman melts. Then one day you're walking across the field and you come across the 2 lumps of coal and the carrot, but you have no knowledge of the tradition of making snowmen. What would be your interpretation? A messy coal man with a careless donkey? But then worse still, say a sheep came along first and ate the carrot, and you were excavating the lumps of coal thousands of years later. That's the problem with our distant past. Fragmented pieces from different jigsaw puzzles, and we just don't know what goes with what. It's a nightmare, but it's so exciting.
People are often horrified when they see a road going straight through the middle of an ancient site. But actually what we're looking at is thousands of years of unbroken human inhabitation. It's where the footpath became the donkey track, which became the lane, which became the road. It's where it's always been, and it's where it belongs.
Welcome to the land of the RSC. And no, I don't mean some regional open-air production of Macbeth by the Royal Shakespeare Company. RSC stands for Recumbent Stone Circle. It's a remarkably unimaginative name coined by early archaeologists for these extraordinary stone circles which have a massive horizontal stone seemingly laying as an altar. In fact, some of them weigh up to 50 tons and were dragged for miles across the countryside and uphill to be placed exactly in position. Fantastic. They're extraordinary for more than one reason. Firstly, here in the Grampians was the highest concentration of stone circles anywhere. There were over 150 of them, and a huge amount of those were these technically brilliant recumbents.
Secondly, and far more importantly, the recumbent stone circles are almost unique to this part of Britain. Why was this arrangement of stones not used elsewhere? Why is the altar stone always placed to lie precisely on the horizontal? Why was that level of accuracy so important that smaller stones would be used to wedge them exactly into the required position?
This is Coffey Muir wood. How long it's been a wood is anyone's guess, but certainly when the circle was erected, the horizon would have been clear to see. And the answer to all those questions is that they were focused on the moon's passage through the heavens in a way not possible further south. They were precisely aligned to mirror the landscape, where up here at this high latitude, at certain points in its cycle, the moon skims the horizon as it dances its way across the sky. We have absolutely no idea what the rituals may have been, or their significance to the community, but the other examples of recumbents in this part of Scotland all emphasise this intent. Genius. Now these are different. Stone circles usually appear to be stone circles, but these? Occasionally we see kists in the middle, but normally the burials associated with stone circles tend to be on the outside. These are clava cairns, so named because the best preserved examples of them are here in the district of Clava, and although very few remain to be seen today, up here around the Moray Firth there were loads of them.
Here the cairns were massive structures, much taller domed buildings than we see today. The middle one is what is known as a ring cairn. The outer two are passage tombs, aligned like Newgrange in Ireland so that the winter solstice sun streams through the passage to illuminate the central chamber. And these strange radial causeways, which may have astronomical alignments, but no one knows for sure. Not far away, the fine example of Corromany still has its passageway intact, giving a much clearer idea of how they would have looked.
What makes them so difficult to interpret is that they were used and adapted over thousands of years. The cairns themselves are between 3,000 and 4,000 years old, but perhaps strangely, the surrounding stone circles were erected much later, around the time that stone circles generally were falling into disuse, and we can only wonder what our ancestors here were thinking. In the same way that many of the deconsecrated churches across Britain have become things like community centres and apartments, the builders' intentions are confusing. And I have to wonder how future archaeologists might decipher our present-day recycling of old buildings. So were the stone circles just fancy refurbishments to the temple, or did they relate to sun worship, built around structures where the alignments had already been made? We'll probably never know.
I've been waiting to come here for years, and actually being here is more breathtaking than I ever imagined. No photograph can capture the sheer majesty of the place. it's a work of Neolithic wonder. Greater even than the astronomical brilliance of the recumbent stone circles, Callanish is the greatest prehistoric observatory of them all. Situated on the Hebridean island of Lewis, I think it's utterly implausible that it was built by the islanders themselves simply for local use. Indeed, one of the enduring legends of Callanish is that it was built by black men who came from over the sea. There is a burial cairn here, but it was added long after the stones were erected, and lacking the stone altar of the recumbents, the implication is that this was a place of science rather than religion. The full lunar cycle of 18.61 years is marked and predicted by these monoliths, but here the wider horizon is the stage. Just once in each cycle, the moon seems to come down from the sky to touch the earth, disappearing behind the hills, only to reappear in a final display, gleaming between the central stones as it passes. We've only scratched the surface of its alignments. Here the intricacy is so complete the impression is one of a finely tuned clock marking the slow but predictable movement of the heavens. Throughout the site, notches and angles are cut into the stones, refining the accuracy and marking certain celestial events. The focus at Callanish of marking the full lunar cycle brings another point to mind which is relevant to many sites throughout the British Isles. The closest you can get to marking 18.61 in stones is 19, the number of stones in many sites, especially in Cornwall, and the closest you can get to marking half that number is 9. Other many circles of 9 stones a slightly less accurate version of the same phenomenon, and do the wider spaces between stones, which we so often interpret as entrances, actually mark a deliberate offset to adjust the inaccuracy of the circle. To me, the insistence on describing the builders of these extraordinary sites as animal skin-wearing farmers is like saying that Britain's motorway system was built by shoppers. Up here, almost at the end of my journey, it brings to mind that I began working on this project about 8 years ago. I've driven about 8,000 miles across the British Isles, and I've no idea how far I've walked. Wouldn't surprise me if it was about 800. Fate must be on my side, because without any deliberate planning, and through constantly shifting weather-dependent schedules, I've arrived here 5 hours before a lunar eclipse.
I said right at the beginning of the film that it's only by being here, standing with these ancient stones, that we can truly begin to get a sense of what they were all about. I've found over all the miles and the monuments that our forebears were so far removed from the insular communities of our imagination. And arriving here accidentally, to be here on the night of a full lunar eclipse, it really does make me appreciate the mystical qualities that seem to have been so important to our ancestors.
Back on the mainland, travelling through the very north of Scotland, we find a region where there are few signs of our ancestors' presence, but every now and again a site like the enormous grey cairns of Campster will remind us that the communities were sizable. The last leg of our journey makes that point all the more evident. Even the harsh environment of Orkney didn't prevent the construction of some of the most impressive monuments of all. The great mound of Maes Howe is much smaller than the enormous Maeve's Cairn in Ireland, but inside the beauty of the skilled workmanship sits in total contrast to the plain exterior. Each wall of the passageway is made of a single piece of stone 30 feet in length, and again the beautifully corbelled central chamber is illuminated by the sun at winter solstice. It's a huge undertaking which, like so many of the sites we've seen, doesn't fit with a small community of simple farming folk. Right across Orkney, this scale is maintained. The enormous ring of Brodgar happens to be the third largest stone circle in Britain after Avebury and Stanton Drew. Such a vast site for a small community of farmers? I don't think so. A little distance away, the improbably tall wedge-cut standing stones of Stennis are even more impressive, even though most of them have gone, and like Brodgar, the ditch and bank have also disappeared.
Throughout the whole of my journey across the British Isles, I've been used to seeing monumental sites, places that were in some way important to communities, or how they treated the dead. We have very few signs of how people actually lived, because the abundance of forest made wood an easily available source material, so very little evidence of daily life remains. What makes Orkney so special is that unlike most of the rest of the British Isles, it was never forested. So timber would have been a valuable scarcity that was reserved for making things like tools and boats.
In 1850, a storm battered the dunes here at Skara Brae and uncovered a Neolithic village. There's a strong sense of community here. The houses are close together and linked by communal passageways, but they remain discreet and private. And rarely do we get such an intimate view of our ancestors. Their homes remain almost as intact as the day they were built, complete with beds which would probably have held mattresses of bracken, a central hearth, even a dresser. I have to wonder if the wooden houses across the rest of Britain wouldn't have had the same type of furniture.
I wish I could express just how magical it is. Like putting my feet in a Neolithic ancestor's footprints at Formby Point. I wonder how many people stood on this exact spot, putting away their personal belongings. Or how many people sat here around the fire, talking and laughing over dinner? And how many people rested a hand here, stepping into bed? Sent shivers up my spine. But even though I could end my journey here, I still have one more thing to show you.
I'm on the island of South Ronaldsay, about 40 miles from Skara Brae. In 1958, at the same time that my mother was waddling around pregnant with me, Ronald Simonson was walking his land here when he stumbled upon an exposed section of stone wall beneath his feet. He had discovered, quite by accident, a chambered tomb dating from the Neolithic period, which turned out to have been in continuous use for about 800 years, well into the early Bronze Age.
When it was excavated, it was found to contain not only human bones, but those of sea eagles as well. An extraordinary discovery of an unknown cult who seemed to revere these magnificent birds to the extent that they included them in their burials. But exciting as that is, it's not why we're here.
When excavations were complete, the tomb had given up a wealth of grave goods. A short distance away from the tomb, close to Ronald Simonson's home, is an intimate and informative museum now run by his daughters Kathleen and Frida. Amongst the relics and treasures from the tomb housed here are human and animal remains, numerous tools, polished axe heads, some jewellery,
and this. A button of polished albitite more finely made than any in your mother's button box. How many times might this have been touched in the simplest of daily routines? How is it actually worn or used? And how many times did someone struggle to get a thread through so fine a hole? My journey has taken me from tantalizing signs of life to intimate signs of lives, ways of life so familiar that they can't fail to bring our ancestors alive in our minds. Across the whole of the British Isles, we've seen evidence of shared knowledge, community, interaction between people across huge distances. The next time you find yourself wondering, how did we lose track of those people? Where did they go? Remind yourself, they didn't go anywhere. We're still here.
Hello, Michael Bott here. Thank you for watching this Prehistory Guys show. There's loads more to watch, and you can get to some of it on this playlist here. If you'd like to receive updates about when we publish new content, hit the subscribe button, and you can unlock even more content by becoming a Patreon supporter. Hit this button here to find out more about that. See you soon.